Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Darden, and I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for joining us today here on Navy Sports Central. I'm your host, and this is the official podcast of the Navy Sports Nation, where we take a deeper dive into Navy sports. In this episode, it has been a couple of weeks, but we're going to go ahead and spend some time breaking down the Navy men's basketball team's big win over the University of Virginia. It was the first time the Mids had taken down a ranked opponent in 35 years since they beat Syracuse in the Carrier Dome. And that was in the second round of the 1986 NCAA basketball tournament. We're actually going to look at both of those games, and we'll talk about some key stats that helped each team get the win and see if there's any kind of common threads there as well. So don't go away. We'll be right back. We'll also have our question of the day and check in with our athletes on the Midwatch. So stay with us. Okay, thanks for being with us, everyone. Whether you are a regular listener or you're checking us out for the first time, thanks for making us part of your day. And as we get going, I got to tell you that I'm still pretty bummed out about Saturday's game against East Carolina. Those were the kinds of games the Mids used to put away a couple years ago, and I think it's basically due to the level of experience. So it was great to see those two big plays in the fourth quarter. Carlinos Acey busted one for 90 yards, and he took it to the house. And then Mikhail Haywood had that awesome 98-yard kickoff return for a touchdown. And I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast, but that kickoff return was the first time that the Mids have pulled one of those off since Gigi Green did it in the bowl game against Arizona State in 2012, I believe. I thought the Mids had the Pirates figured out on defense when they kept them out of the end zone in the third quarter, but unfortunately, they couldn't stop them on that 4th and 4. And of course, that long pass to set up the game-winning field goal really hurt. And right now they've got no choice but to just absorb this loss and get ready for Temple. But I will say that it's really hard to see the team sitting at 2-8 when they've shown flashes of being so much better than that in the last month or so. Besides that, it's been a pretty interesting past couple of weeks as the fall sports have just about wound down and the winter teams start getting into their seasons. Both soccer teams had their seasons come to an end in the semifinals of the Patriot League tournament. The women lost to Bucknell in overtime, and man, that was a tough one. And I will tell you that I did not feel good about that game from the beginning. I'd mentioned in the last podcast that the Bison jumped on the Mids pretty early in the first game that they played them in and beat them, I believe, 4-2. And this time, it was just a matter of a team just getting hot at the right time of the year. The Bison grabbed the last, I think they were the number 4 seed, I believe. And they took care of 5th seeded Lehigh first, and then they ended up playing the Mids next. But that game was just a defensive battle the whole way. Nobody had scored after 90 minutes. And then just a few minutes into the first overtime, Bucknell converted on an opportunity in the Navy zone, and that's what sent them to the championship game. And in fact, they won that as well. They beat Boston University 1-0 to win the title. So number 4 seed ended up winning it all this time around. The men's soccer team got into the tournament as a number 6 seed, and then they knocked off Lehigh to get into the semifinals. So that was pretty cool. But then they ran into American University, and this is a team that just really seems to have the Mids number. The Eagles beat them less than a week earlier in the final game of the regular season, and then they did it again in a tournament, winning by a score of 4-2. So American University did advance, but unlike Bucknell on the women's side, they weren't able to keep that going. Loyola defeated them 2-1 in the championship game to punch their ticket to the NCAA tournament. So this year's Patriot League champions for men's soccer are the Loyola Greyhounds. So overall, there are a lot of positives for both teams. Of course, with the women being 2-time defending champions, it would have been great to see them make the final to see if they could make it 3 in a row. But the Patriot League is extremely competitive, and there are several really good teams that can win on any given day. So while I know the team may be disappointed that they didn't get an opportunity to defend, the seniors can still claim 2 Patriot League titles, and that's not easy to do. I also think Coach O'Donoghue's men's teams performed equally well this year. They upset Lehigh to make it to the semifinals, and they'll be returning several strong players next season, including Sidney Paris, Christian Coelho, Baba Kali, and David Jackson. And I don't want to forget Charlie Creel either. Matt Nacita is going to be pretty tough to replace, but the Mids had a very talented freshman class this year, so I know there's going to be somebody who's going to be ready to step up and fill that gap. And then finally, the volleyball team just wrapped up their season over the weekend. The Mids were seeded 6th in the Patriot League tournament, and that meant they had to play number 3 seeded Army for the second time on the road in less than 10 days. But Coach Labrador had the team ready. They absolutely overwhelmed the Black Knights 3-0 to advance to the semifinals. Unfortunately, that meant them having to play number 1 Colgate on their home court. So the two teams had split their games earlier in the year, with each team winning at home. And that's what happened this time as well. The Raiders came out on top 3-1, and that ended Navy's season. But it was a pretty decent year overall. The record may not reflect it. I think they were 8-8 in the Patriot League this year. But keep in mind that this year's team was pretty young, and they lost a major point producer to graduation last year in Maggie Scatoni. And Avery Stoll, Cammie Herman, and Taylor Gray will also be moving on this year. But this team is loaded with talented underclassmen, including the Llewellyn sisters, Maggie Bodman, and Anna Kleemeyer. So I definitely see the Mids continuing to challenge for a Patriot League title in the next few years. Real quickly, I did want to mention the water polo team. They made it to the finals of the Mid-Atlantic Conference tournament. Unfortunately, they came up short against Furman by a score of 9-6 in the championship game. But a pretty solid season for Coach Louis Nicolaou's team. They played a really challenging non-conference schedule, but that really put them in pretty good shape for when they did start conference play, because they finished with a 9-3 record going into the tournament, and they snagged the number 2 seed. So really good job overall to the Navy water polo team. All right, that gets you caught up on all the fall teams that are finishing things up. Let's go ahead and take a short break, and when we return, we'll get into our deep dive segment. Okay, it is time for our deep dive segment, and today we're going to look at 2 signature basketball games within the Navy men's program. One was just played a couple weeks ago, and the other one took place way back in the Reagan administration. So whenever things like this occur, I like to dig a little deeper to see what happened that resulted in an outcome that basically no one expected. Were there any similarities? What were the key moments in each game? Things like that. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, as most of you probably know, the Navy men's basketball team pulled off a huge win in their first game of the season. They beat the University of Virginia 66-58, and that was their first win over a ranked opponent in 35 years. The Cavs were ranked number 25 at the time, and remember that they won the national championship just a couple of years ago. Now, the last time the Mids took down a ranked team, the date was March 16th, 1986. I remember because I was just finishing up flight school at the time. And it was in the second round of the NCAA tournament, and they were playing the Syracuse Orangemen. Back then they were the Orangemen. Now they're just known as the Orange. They finished the regular season ranked 9th in the country and had earned a number 2 seed going into the tournament. Now, of course, Navy was led by David Robinson and Vernon Butler. They were ranked 17th in the country after winning the conference title. That earned them a number 7 seed for the tournament in the same region as Syracuse, obviously. After beating Tulsa in the first round, they had to face the Orange in their own backyard again. They just lost to them pretty badly in December. And most of the so-called experts already had them as tournament run ending that night with Syracuse advancing to the Sweet 16. All right, so that gives you a little bit of the history. Now, heading into the Virginia game a couple weeks ago, the only thing that Navy fans knew for sure was that Cam Davis, who was their leading scorer the last 2 seasons, would not be on the floor. But they were returning 4 starters, though. And defensively, I figured they could make the Cavaliers work hard for their points. But if you follow college basketball closely, you know that Virginia is also very well known for their defense. So I wasn't really sure what the story was going to be with the Mids offensively with the loss of Cam Davis. What I did know going into this contest was that the Mids would probably need to outperform Virginia in a couple of key categories that typically wouldn't be considered strengths of theirs in order to have a chance at winning. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a recap of the Navy-Syracuse game, and then I'll go through the Virginia game next. Once we've covered what happened, then we can start getting into the numbers to see what the Mids did specifically to help them win each game. And the reason I think this is kind of fun is because sometimes you never know what you're going to uncover in terms of common elements. I mean, these games were played 35 years apart, but in the scheme of things, basketball is basketball, right? So there's a pretty good chance that you'll see a lot of the same things coming together that allowed the Mids to win both of these games. And by the way, before we get started, I just want to let you know that there is an excellent series on the Navy Sports website that covers the 1986 men's basketball team. It was written by Justin Kashevsky, and he's one of the sports information directors at the Academy. He covers specifically men's basketball. It's pretty comprehensive, and that series is actually the primary source for this segment, along with some pretty grainy YouTube footage. So I just wanted to give credit where credit is due there. Anyway, when the Mids did take the floor against Syracuse for that second round game, they definitely had a big chip on their shoulder. The Orange had handled them pretty easily in their first meeting back up in the Carrier Dome. So when the NCAA scheduling committee was looking to send Navy back up there for a second time, potentially in front of a national audience, that did seem a little bit cruel to me. And of course, nobody was giving them any kind of chance to win the game either. One Syracuse reporter referred to the Mids as a bunch of short hairs with no chance of winning. And at first, it looked like he might be right. The Orange were led by Dwayne Pearl Washington, who was considered one of the top guards in the country, and they jumped out on top pretty quickly, 17-8. In fact, 5 out of their first 8 baskets were either layups or dunks, so it was definitely a fairly intimidating start by the Orange, and the Mids basically took one right between the eyes and had to regroup and fight back. But they did settle down, and when they were down by 7 at 21-14, they ended up scoring 10 out of the next 12 points to go up by 1. And it was Vernon Butler that gave him the 24-23 lead after making a layup, and that was with about 5 or so minutes left in the first half. And by the way, for those of you who never had a chance to see Vernon Butler play, I'm going to put a link to the highlights from the game in the show notes. And like I said, it's not the best quality, but I encourage you to check it out because you'll see that whenever Butler got the ball down low, especially on the low block, he was going to get that shot to go down. I mean, he had really, really good footwork, but most importantly, he had super soft hands. And that came in handy when he had to put the ball up off the glass, coming off of a weird angle or something like that. So if you do watch the video and you hear the ball actually hitting the glass and the rim, it sounds like he's just getting off a bunch of clunky shots and they're going in. But part of that was just where the mic was located and that was picking up the sound. But trust me, Butler was the real deal. He ended up scoring 23 points in that game on 11 of 15 shooting. So the guy was no joke. So like I said, when he scored on that layup to put Navy ahead, there were about 5 minutes left in the half. And then the lead did change hands a couple more times, but the Mids went into the locker room leading 32-31. In the second half, the game really changed. Things began to open up a little bit. But Butler and Robinson continued to pound the Orange inside, and Robinson in particular was getting to the line pretty often too. In fact, he was doing a pretty good job of keeping the Syracuse front line in foul trouble, which made it even easier for him to operate. Navy began to extend the lead, and when Syracuse decided to change things up and go into full court press, that turned out to be a mistake because the Mids were really, really skilled at breaking that press, and that resulted in a bunch of easy dunks for Robinson coming off of feeds from both Kyler Whitaker and Cliff Reese, who were 2 of Navy's guards. I think one area where the experts really did underestimate the Mids was with their ability to get up and down the court. I mean, you wouldn't think it to look at them, but they were not afraid to get out and run, and they did a pretty good job of it, particularly Robinson. I mean, I think that when you think about the mid-'80s, and he was, we'll call it 7 foot, 7'1". If I had to place his weight, I'd say he was probably around 230 or so. But not many big men could move the way he did. I mean, this guy just glided up and down the court, and to see him fill in a lane coming down on a 2-on-1 or even a 3-on-1 break, if you're the defender, that's got to be pretty scary. Now, with about 8 minutes to go in the game, Navy had basically extended the lead out to 10 points, and things were getting pretty nervous for Syracuse. Pearl Washington did a great job trying to keep Syracuse from going down. I mean, he scored 28 points in the game, but it wasn't enough. And at one point, the Navy lead actually got to 20. They scored 65 points in the second half, so that was more than double what their first half output was. And they ended up winning that game 97-85 to advance to the Sweet 16. Obviously, it was a huge win for the program. They ended up going to the Meadowlands for the next round, and they beat Cleveland State to make it to the Elite Eight. And that's when they ran into the Duke Blue Devils, who ended their season with, I guess, what was that score? I think it was 71-50, so not terribly close. And the Blue Devil strategy really was to neutralize Vernon Butler. I mean, they did a good job keeping him under control, which kind of limited. I mean, they're basically willing to let Robinson get his 20 or so points. They just didn't want to get him, going on a big dunk fest like he did against Syracuse. So anyway, that was the Navy-Syracuse game. Now let's go ahead and fast forward to a couple of weeks ago. The Mids were coming off a solid year that unfortunately went off the rails at exactly the wrong time. They had finished 12-1 in the conference, and they had a number one seed going into the tournament. But both Cam Davis and Richard Njoku had to sit out their first-round game against Loyola because of COVID protocols. And Loyola was a team that Navy had beaten 2 times in a row. Unfortunately, had to play them a third consecutive time. So think about that for a second. Not only did they beat them twice, but because of that weird scheduling last year in the Patriot League because of COVID, they played Loyola twice on successive days and beat them. And then they had a few days off before they started the tournament. And that's when they found out that Davis couldn't play. So unfortunately, they couldn't do it a third time with 2 of their best players not being in the lineup. And so their season ended on a pretty lousy note. Now, going into the Virginia game, the Mids had to deal with some injuries at the guard position, in addition to coming up with a way to replace Cam Davis's point production. And Virginia wasn't the same team as the one that won the national championship, obviously, but they were still pretty tough. I mean, they did come in ranked 25th, and they had a senior transfer named Jaden Gardner from East Carolina, who was a very, very good player. And by the way, the Cavs were 15.5-point favorites at home against the Mids. But get this, they played their games at a place called John Paul Jones Arena. So I thought that was a little ironic considering what ended up happening. In any case, the 2 teams played each other pretty evenly through the first 7 or 8 minutes of the game. The weird thing was that Navy was doing most of their damage from beyond the arc. And historically, that's not their game. But both John Carter Jr. and Sean Yoder were just in this crazy zone. Yoder hit his first shot he took was a 3. In fact, I don't think he took anything other than a 3 in the first 10 minutes of the game, and he hit all 3 of them. And Carter was actually 4 for 4 as well. So that really kept them going. Virginia was getting up and down the court fairly well, but it was those 3-pointers that was keeping the Mids even. And they're also going after every rebound. I think they had 16 rebounds compared to 12 for Virginia in the first half. And a couple of those were offensive rebounds that they were able to convert into points. So those 2 things together, the aggressive rebounding and the 3-point shooting, helped give Navy a 42-35 lead at halftime. And you could tell that they were playing with a ton of confidence. Now, when the second half got going, it seemed to me like everything was setting up for Virginia to make a comeback. Their shots were coming much easier, while the Mids were having to work quite a bit harder for theirs. And part of the reason for that was because they had cooled off from 3-point range. I think they only hit 2 out of 8 in the second half. And I figured that was going to happen because, not even the best 3-point shooting team can keep up the rate that they were shooting in the first half, which I think was at about an 80% clip between Yoder and John Carter Jr. And I think overall in the first half, they had hit on 8 of 12 3-pointers. But anyway, the Mids led by 2, 53-51, with just over 11 minutes to go in the game. And then coming out of a TV timeout, they switched to a 3-2 zone. So most of the time they're going man-to-man. This time they switched up to that 3-2 zone, which I remember when I spoke with Austin Inge last year, I did a blog feature on him. He mentioned that of all the zones that they play, that 3-2 zone is probably their strongest. Now, the Cavs did pull even at 55 with about 8:45 left, but then they would only score 1 more basket the rest of the game. The Mids completely messed them up by switching to that zone defense, and nothing was going down for them. And like I said, the Mids played really, really good defense. Their hands were very, very active. They were getting a lot of pass deflections, steals. They were forcing turnovers, wild passes out of bounds and that sort of thing. So Virginia was definitely out of sorts. There's no question about that. The only problem was Navy was having some issues scoring also. So the score stayed tied for over 3 minutes until Yoder hit a short-range jumper right in the lane. And then he followed that up with a really, really nice reverse layup to put the Mids up by 4. And it was still anyone's game with about 2 minutes left when Daniel Deaver grabbed a big-time offensive rebound, and he got the putback to extend the lead to 6. So now it was 61-55. And that was still the score with about I guess it was 24 seconds left. Yeah, so about a minute and a half had gone by. And Navy was bringing the ball down the court, and Deaver took a pass at the top of the key, and he spotted John Carter Jr. wide open on the left wing. Did not waste any time getting him the ball. Carter nailed the three-pointer, and that basically put the game away. Virginia did get that 3 to finally break that scoring drought. And like I said, it was more than 8.5 minutes between baskets. And the Mids just, after that, closed them out with a couple of free throws, which made the final score 66-58. So a very, very impressive win. The Mids defense was just unbelievable down the stretch. They really threw Virginia a curveball by going to that 3-2 zone, and that was really the difference in the game. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a short break, and when we return, we'll take a quick look at some of the factors that played into these big wins that Navy came up with 35 years apart. Stay with us. Okay, welcome back to Navy Sports Central. Carl Darden here with you, and we have just finished a recap of 2 of the biggest wins in Navy men's basketball. Both came against ranked teams, and they took place 35 years apart. Now, even though that's a lot of time between games, I still get a kick out of seeing what the similarities and differences were in them, and which ones figured in the teams getting the win. So I'm going to start with the defense, which is what I tend to focus on a lot when it comes to basketball. Let's start with the Syracuse game. That year, the Orange averaged close to 84 points a game, and they were doing that against a pretty high-level competition, too. Remember, they came from the Big East, which was one of the power conferences back in the mid-'80s, and they did win a share of the Big East title along with St. John's. Now, I'm guessing that the Syracuse fans figured that the Mids were no match for their team athletically, and they maybe even thought that they could get to 100 points, which wasn't out of the question, at least in their minds. The Orange had done it at least 2 or 3 other times, including in their first round game. I can't remember who they played. I think it was like Brown or somebody like that. But anyway, teams tended to underestimate Navy's interior defense. David Robinson finished the year with 207 blocked shots. And just to give you some perspective, that was more than every single team in Division I basketball except for one, which was Louisville. And by the way, they were the national champions that year. So David Robinson by himself had more blocks than every other team in Division I basketball except for the national champs. And then having to deal with Butler was no fun either. He wasn't the shot blocker that Robinson was, but he was 6'7" and at least 230 pounds, probably more. It's just from looking at him. And he pulled down close to 9 rebounds a game. Now, against Syracuse, Robinson and Butler created all kinds of problems for the Orange in the middle. Robinson had 7 block shots, and the 2 of them really limited Ronnie Cyclé and Howard Trish to a total of 10 points. Those 2 guys were good for about 18 points a game combined during the regular season. So with the middle basically shut down, most of the shots that the Orange took had to come from the outside, and Navy did a really good job of holding Syracuse to almost 6% below their normal field goal average of 54%. In fact, in the first half, despite that quick start that the Orange got off to, the Mids had held them to about 40%. And in the second half, most of Syracuse's made field goals came kind of when it was garbage time, because remember, they were up by 20, Navy was up by 20 points at one time. And a lot of those made field goals came when the game was basically pretty much decided. Now, you'll remember I said that the game really opened up in the second half. Remember, the first half, the score was 32-31 Navy. In the second half, the Mids scored 65 points, and the Orange scored 54. So it was definitely a little bit more of an up-and-down game. And a lot of that just came because Syracuse was throwing that full-court press at the Mids, and they were just destroying it. I don't know that that Syracuse ever, caused any kind of turnover significantly anyway, off of that full court press. In the meantime, it gave the Mids a chance to get out and run, which, like I said, a lot of people didn't give them enough credit for being able to play that kind of game. All right, so interior defense, that was the key that was one of the keys anyway in the first game back in 1986. In the Virginia game just a couple weeks ago, the Mids got it done by playing terrific team defense. And like I said, when they went to that 3-2 zone with about 10, 11 minutes left to go in the game and held Virginia scoreless for about 8.5 minutes, that was really the difference maker. And just to give you some perspective, in the second half, Virginia had exactly half as many field goals as they did in the first half. I believe it was 14 in the first half compared to just 7 on 25 attempts in the second half. The Cavs just couldn't get anything to go. Their rhythm was all messed up. And on the other hand, Navy had guys like Yoder and John Carter Jr. who hit some clutch shots, especially down the stretch to help put the game away. So the defense was definitely one of the keys in these two big games when it came to Navy being able to get the win. With the 86 game against Syracuse, it was just a really, really tough interior defense. And against Virginia a couple of weeks ago, it was more of a team defense that was sparked by that move to the 3-2 zone in the middle of the second half. All right, now let's look at the offensive side of the ball. And the first thing that jumped out at me back from the 1986 game was the free throw statistics. On the year, Navy and Syracuse weren't that different. The Mids averaged about 27 attempts per game, and they shot about 64% from the line, which is not great. But and then the Orange had about 23 attempts per game, and they shot about 69% from the free throw line. But things were way, way different in this game. Syracuse was 13 of 20 from the line, so that wasn't too far off their norms. But you got to check out Navy's numbers. The Mids went to the line an incredible 52 times. 52. I mean, to me, that's an unbelievable number, especially when you consider the fact that they were playing Syracuse in the Carrier Dome. A visiting team almost never gets that kind of love from the referees, especially in a game like this. I mean, the Orange had every advantage. This was an NCAA tournament game, and they were playing it on their home court. But it didn't seem to bother the Mids because they converted on 41 of those 52 attempts to shoot 79% from the line. And that was just a matter of Coach Paul Evans just telling the Navy offense to be aggressive and just go right at the Orange. David Robinson had 35 points for the game, and most of those came from the free throw line. He was 21 of 27 from the line, and I think his number of attempts still ranks in the top 3 for an NCAA tournament game. Sophomore Cliff Reese was a perfect 10 for 10 from the free throw line. And if you look at it another way, the Mids made over twice as many free throws as the Orange attempted during the game. So they made 41 free throws, and Syracuse only attempted 20 for the entire contest. So after the game, one of the reporters asked Jim Boeheim about the disparity in the free throws, and he basically discounted it, really. But I really don't see how you could. The Orange actually outscored Navy from the field 72-56. I mean, they took 27 more shots, but the Mids had a 28-point advantage at the free throw line. So as far as I'm concerned, you don't need to look much further than that to figure out how they won the game. Like I was saying before, the Mids made up their mind to play really aggressive basketball. They got Syracuse in foul trouble early. I think they had 4 people foul out of that game. And getting to the line is what made the difference because they rarely missed when they got there. In the Virginia game a couple of weeks ago, the Mids did 2 things especially well on offense. First, they won the rebound battle. They had 35 overall compared to 30 for the Cavaliers. And the Cavs, not surprisingly, were the bigger team. And in addition to that, as I had mentioned before, the Mids were able to convert on a handful of offensive rebounds and turn them into points when it really counted. Navy also shot really, really well from the 3-point line in the first half. We kind of touched on that already. They hit 8 of 12 as a team, and both Carter and Yoder were a perfect 7 for 7. So that was enough to give them that 7-point cushion at halftime. In the second half, they only made 2 shots from long range off of 8 attempts, but one of them was Carter's final shot, which basically put the nail in the coffin for the Mids with 24 seconds left. And the fact is that neither team shot particularly well because both team defenses were pretty sharp. But the Mids were able to string together a few baskets in those last 8 minutes while the Cavs just couldn't manage a single hoop until Armin Franklin got that 3-pointer with about 15 seconds left in the game. So It was great to see the mids get hot like that from three-point land, but to be fair, they don't typically shoot 50% from there. Last season, they shot just under 33%, which I wouldn't say is horrible, but they're smart not to consistently rely on the three-point shot to win games. I think they get it done by just playing really good transition basketball and just looking for the best available shot, even if it is a mid-range shot. Personally, I think it's great to have the three-point shot as a weapon, but teams that build their offenses around that risk losing every time they have a bad shooting night. The mids really developed a nice mid-range game last season, and having that kind of versatility this year should be a bonus, when they get into the Patriot League schedule. So from the 86 season, it was free throws. From the game just a couple of weeks ago, it was just really timely three-point shooting and also a rebounding. And here's the third reason I think both teams won those big games, and it came down to one thing, and that was experience. Now, if you go back and look at that 1986 team, their starting five consisted of two seniors. They were Butler and Whitaker, two juniors, Robinson and Wojcik, and one sophomore, who's Reese. Now, I certainly wouldn't call that a senior-heavy lineup, but in this particular case, I'm talking about big game experience. A lot of people forget that in the previous year, the mids got to the tournament as a number 13 seed, and they played a really, really good LSU team who was seeded fourth. And the mids just destroyed them. So they were no strangers to big games. Over the course of those two full seasons, when you talk about 85 and then 86, they'd been tested a bunch of times. So when it came time to take on the Orange again, the mids' experience in those big games really helped put them in a position to win. Now, when you look at this year's Navy team, they've got four starters returning. John Carter Jr. and Greg Summers are seniors. Tyler Nelson and Daniel Deaver are juniors. And the only player who's coming back that didn't start last year was Sean Yoder. He got his first start against the Cavaliers in that first game. Also, coming off the bench, you have Richard Njoku, who started all 15 games last year. So he brings a ton of experience when he gets onto the floor. My guess his minutes will start to go up because he is a pretty important factor in the mids offense. And I'm not sure if he's just a little bit banged up and they're just kind of working him back a little at a time. But I expect to see a lot more of Njoku in the future. And then also another player we haven't seen yet is Austin Inge, who is an excellent defender. He's a sophomore this year who had a terrific campaign last season as a freshman. So again, we're not talking about a starting lineup that's packed with seniors, but Navy is bringing back a solid group of returning starters, just like that 1986 team. And they've also got some great experience coming in off the bench. Now, last year they beat Georgetown on the road in the very first game of the year, and then they followed that up with a 15-3 record overall and 12-1 in the Patriot League, like I'd mentioned before. So that gives them a lot of experience, and that's why you just never saw them cave when the Cavaliers kept coming at them in the second half. So that pretty much does it for my breakdown on these two great games. Even though they were 35 years apart, both Navy teams used defense and experience to help them come out on top. In 1986, the mids stayed aggressive and got to the line where they made the Orange pay. And in the game against Virginia, the mids just shot really well from the three-point line. And by the way, remember that the three-point line didn't even exist in 1986. It was first used in a tournament the following year in 1987. So back then, the mids even have that option. And I will tell you this, if it had been available back then, there's no telling what kind of numbers Kyler Whitaker would have rung up because that guy was an excellent, excellent outside shooter. But the mids were able to use the three-point shot to their advantage against Virginia. They hit on 2/3 of their shots in the first half to help take them to that 7-point lead. And then their patience on offense eventually paid off with some key baskets in the final 8 minutes, and that's what made the difference. But at the end of the day, it was that big game experience that both of these teams had in common that helped them earn these two huge signature wins for the program. And when it comes to college basketball, there's usually no substitute for that. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a quick breather. And when we return, we will get into our question of the day and our mid-watch segment. Okay, we are back. We are back. Thanks for hanging with us, everybody, on Navy Sports Central. And now it's time to get into our question of the day. First, let's take a look at some of the responses from our question from a couple of weeks ago. If you recall, we were talking about the Navy wins over Notre Dame in the last, we'll call it 15 years or so. And the question was, besides 2007, which Navy win over Notre Dame was your favorite and why? And the choices were in 2009 when the Mids beat the Irish in South Bend 23-21. Next is 2010, and that's when Navy torched them in the Meadowlands 35-17. And then the final choice was the 2016 game when Will Worth led the Mids to the win in the game that was played down in Jacksonville. So as we look at all the results that came in, it looks like the 2016 game had the most votes with 13. And that was followed by the 2010 game with 9 votes. And then came the 2009 game with 3 votes. I will tell you that picking the 2016 game makes a lot of sense. Will Worth had that offense running about as well as I'd ever seen it run. And the Mids did an excellent job of playing keep away from Notre Dame in the last 7 minutes of the game. In fact, they didn't even touch the ball. But maybe, I think it was like they had 2 possessions in the second half and only 6 for the entire game. So just an awesome display of triple option football by the Mids there. Now, as far as the comments go, I have to say that the best one came from my classmate Greg Shore, who wrote the following. He says, "A good football Saturday is when Navy wins. A great football Saturday is when Navy wins and Notre Dame loses." And he goes on to say, "To be at my first Navy Notre Dame game in 2016 and watch us take the bacon, it's my favorite game of all as an alum." So, Greg, I got to tell you, I wasn't at the game, obviously, but I saw it on television, and I'm 100% with you on that one. Anytime that the Irish come up on the wrong end of the score, as far as I'm concerned, is the right end of the score from my perspective. Now, when I look back at those 3 games, I definitely like that 2016 game, but the one I'm going to go with was the one in 2010 when Ricky Dobbs and Alex Teach just absolutely rolled over the Irish. I mean, it was just an awesome display of offensive and defensive football, and it's probably the best complete game I've seen the Mids play against the Irish for sure, and certainly it probably ranks within the top 4 or 5 games within the triple option era. There's no question about that. It was also the 3rd time in 4 years that the Mids had beaten the Irish, so that was really something. And the fact that they were able to do it in Brian Kelly's first year coaching Notre Dame made it all the sweeter for me. Okay, so that takes care of our question from our last episode. Now let's go ahead and jump to this one. And here it is. It's a basketball question. David Robinson is by far Navy's most decorated basketball player. In addition to leading the country in block shots in 1986, remember we talked about the fact that he had 207. He also had the most number of rebounds that year. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a range of rebounds, and I'm going to ask you to pick which one that the Admiral's number fell in. Okay, so first choice is 250 to 350 rebounds. Second choice is 350 to 450. Third choice is 450 to 550. And the last choice is more than 550. Okay, so there you go. I'm going to go ahead and put that question up on the Navy Sports Nation group page later today. So be on the lookout for that. It's going to be in the announcements section. And I will go ahead and pin it to the top of the page for at least the first few days. Okay. All right. And finally, let's go ahead and wind things up by checking in with our mid-watch athlete. We have Avery Stoll to talk about because remember, we were all finished up with Ashwin Briggs after the Navy cross country team won the Patriot League championships there. But anyway, Stoll, as you recall, was our senior co-captain on the volleyball team, and she closed out an outstanding career by helping her team get to the Patriot League semifinals. I think I mentioned a couple episodes ago that I did have a chance to watch Stoll play live when I was in Annapolis last month. And I will tell you that I really got an appreciation for her offensive skills. For the year, Stoll finished with 269 kills while averaging 2.8 kills per set. So she led the team in both of those categories. And defensively, she ranked 3rd on the team in blocks behind Maggie Bodman and Anna Kleemeyer. And the final thing I will mention is that Stoll was at her best in the Patriot League tournament in these 2 games versus Army and also Colgate. Against Army, she came up with 12 kills. And even though the Mids lost to the number 1 seeded Colgate Raiders in the semifinals, Stoll just left it all out on the court. She led the team with 18 kills, and she came up with 2 service aces, 5 blocks, and 10 digs. So really a tremendous effort there. The mids are going to be bringing back a really talented group next year, but Stoll's talent and leadership are really going to be missed next year for sure. So congratulations, Avery, on a fantastic Navy volleyball career, and we wish you the very best in the future. That's going to do it for this edition of Navy Sports Central. Thank you all so much for joining us. Now, if you like what you've heard, make sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and remember to spread the word to all the other Navy fans out there. We have been getting a great response to our question of the day, so if you want to jump in on that, just go to the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page, and I'll go ahead and pin it to the top so you won't miss it. And just a quick reminder, the views expressed on Navy Sports Central are my own and do not reflect those of the U.S. Naval Academy or Navy Athletics. By the way, the music used in Navy Sports Central comes to you courtesy of Audio Jungle. This is a great site for purchasing the rights to use music from thousands of artists around the world, and those we feature in the podcast will be credited in our show notes. Talk to you soon, everybody. Until next time, this is Carl Darden. Go Navy, beat Army.